Last bit to say is to introduce our speaker. He was born and bred in North Herefordshire, and we have to thank him for being here today, because obviously we weren't quite sure what was happening with the weather, and he has come from a distance. So I'd like to introduce Patrick Faulkner this morning to give us our talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you all hear me to start with? Yes. Shout out if you can't. My voice is not that clear or powerful, so please shout out. Thank you for the introduction. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. As already said, I was born in the wilds of West Herefordshire a long time ago. Been lucky enough to spend most of my life in or around woodlands. I ran my own woodworking business for over 40 years, where we would go into woods, cut trees, take them home, convert them, make things for people, etc. And then 16 years ago, I was invited by an organisation called the Deer Initiative to work part-time as a deer management consultant. And what that, in simple terms, means to deal with anything to do with wild deer, from meeting landowners, woodland owners, assessing deer species populations, all types of training, events like this, etc., etc. So the whole aspect of wild deer. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is, as it says up there, the wild deer of Shropshire. I'm going to sort of go through it fairly quickly because there's a lot of information, and I'd like you to sort of see the big picture if possible. This is where the battle with technology starts. So, wild deer of Shropshire. Nationally, we've got 6 species living in the wild. If you can see my little red dot, we've got red deer, roe deer, fallow deer. Those 2 are natives. The fallow is now called a naturalized. We've got a little thing here, the Muntjak, Chinese water deer, and sika deer, Japanese sika deer. They are non-natives and have escaped or been illegally released into the wild at some point in the last sort of 100 years or so. So in Shropshire, apart from 1 or 2 other oddments, we have fallow deer, which are the most prominent species, roe deer, and Muntjak. So I'm going to go through a little bit of information about each of those species, so if you weren't aware before, hopefully you'll know a bit more afterwards. So our fallow deer have been here since Norman times, historically mainly kept in parks, because you'll see in a minute how pretty they are with their spots and so on their coat. Escaped during the First and Second World Wars because many of our young men, particularly the gamekeepers and farm workers, went off to fight. And the boundary fences to keep the deer in were neglected, abandoned, etc., and the deer went out into the wild. And what confuses a lot of people is that they come in 4 different colours. Black, that's fairly obvious, black is black, but they come in different shades of black, unfortunately. Or white, they are not albinos, they are a pure white species in their own right. Common, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, that means that in the summer they are a chestnut colour with lots of white spots on. And then Mennel, which is a sort of biscuity oatmeal colour, and they are the only one of the 4 colour coats that keep the spots all year round. But they are all fallow deer. There is one other slight exception, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, which is quite important. And they are all termed as intermediate feeders. In other words, they will feed on grass, farm crops, woodland plants, young trees, shrubs, anything like that. They'll eat the whole range and variety. So, here is a distribution map. You'll see the latest date on there is 2007. There is a reason for that, and that is because the current distribution maps that were produced by the British Deer Society are so complex. It's too complicated for us to absorb in sort of a simple observation. So it shows us the trend. In 1972, you can see where the dark areas were. We're up here somewhere. up to 2007, you can see the population is spreading. Mainly in England and Wales, a few up in Scotland, but mainly England and Wales. So it just gives you the trend, and that's what I wanted you to be aware of. And on the picture over here, there is a black one. Here is a common coated one. You can just see the spots. And if you can see it there, is one of the mennels. It's much lighter in colour, and it's got lots of big white spots on it. And the other key feature with the fallow deer is that they have long tails. They're about 9 inches to a foot long. And one of the difficulties we find people often have is identifying what species it is that's just gone galloping through the woods out of sight. So if you look at the tail, it'll tell you. If it's got a long tail, usually with a black stripe down the middle, that's a fallow deer. I'll explain about the other tails or not as we get to them. Am I going too quickly for you? Shout if I am. So there's sort of some examples of the different colour coats. We have this anomaly, and here is an ordinary common coated fallow. I took this picture a couple of weeks ago in the wood by my house. That's the colour they go in the winter, this dark mousy grey. But this thing on the right is also a fallow deer, but you'll see it has long hair in its ears, and it's not quite so visible, but its side hair is also long. And they're called long-coated, and it's the only place in the world where they exist. Not in this particular wood, but in the South Shropshire Herefordshire borders. They're not a subspecies as was thought at one stage. They are a genetic freak. But if you see one of those in the woods, you may think, what on earth is that? And sometimes they have much longer hair, so they look quite peculiar. But you know, they're quite unique. And I think we're lucky to have them. So, one of the things that involves me quite a lot is what do these characters get up to in their daily habits and activities and so on. And key feature here is that an adult fallow will eat about 12 pounds or 2 tons of food a year. So do we have any farmers in the audience today? No? Well, if I'll show you some pictures in a minute of some agricultural crops. And of course, 2 tons of food can equate to a lot of money. Here is a hedgerow that was destroyed for the second time by fallow deer, and the farmer, because it was 2 different ownerships, he was not very pleased because he'd invested money in that hedge. The deer had destroyed the hedge, and the chap next door wasn't very happy because the deer from this side were getting into his crops that side, and so on and so on. So that's quite a common thing to occur. So they don't just eat trees. There is a wheat crop where they've been walking through regularly, so they haven't necessarily eaten the corn, but they are causing impact and damage to that crop. Here we have a field that I think it was Swedes, if my memory serves me right, and unfortunately they don't read the books about what they're supposed to do, so they don't eat a whole Swede. They take a bite out of one, they walk a bit and take a bite out of another. So they can quickly damage a big area. And then, of course, this time of year, those Swedes will go rotten because they've been damaged, and so the impact again can be quite high and quite expensive to the farmer. There's an aerial photograph I took, again, of a wheat field a few years ago, and you can see, apart from all the tracks and trails where they've been walking through, that's done enough damage on its own, in its own right. But once they flatten it, where they've been laid, that lets other creatures, birds and so on, into the crop. Pigeons, crows, pheasants, whatever, can get in there now and start eating it. So there's another problem. So there's a cost to that farmer. And I am reliably informed by a friend of mine who is a very good cereal grower that the profit of that crop compared to the overall cost of production is about 3%. So we may think that farmers driving around in big smart Range Rovers or tractors that cost £100,000 are very rich. That crop is virtually a financial write-off. And that was one of half a dozen fields in that area that were damaged in a similar way. So it's costing that man quite a lot of money. But it doesn't end there. Here is a field of oilseed rape. And again, if you can see all the little tracks and trails all the way through, and these animals have been living in there all through the summer. But in a few weeks' time, the male fallow lose their antlers to start growing the new ones. Flies pester them, so they go and live in these crops to keep away from the flies. So they haven't eaten much of that crop, but as the seed pods ripen and they walk around in there, the seeds cast, go onto the floor, so the farmer has lost his cash crop. And I'll show you what happens later on in a moment. So there's all sorts of damage that the deer can cause to the crops. Now here we have an example. You won't be able to see, but there are little tiny seedlings here, and they are actually oilseed rape. That is next year's crop, planted in a field which had previously had wheat in it. And there's an example of where the deer had flattened the crop. As a result of that, the wheat seeds that come out of the ears got pushed into the ground, and they've now germinated. So now the farmer's got a problem, and this was a 50-acre field, I guess, where I took this picture, and there was patches like this all over it. So now he's got a problem. He's got his little rape seeds trying to grow, and it's full of wheat, which he does not want in that crop because it will contaminate the seeds when it goes off to the merchant. So he now has to invest in a very expensive selective weed killer that will kill the wheat seedlings but leave the rape seeds. So there's another added cost onto the problem of deer impact. So that's a little insight into fallow deer, and what they get up to. So now roe deer, native species, been here since the Ice Age. They were nearly wiped out in the 1300s because the king of the day decided he'd had enough of chasing these little tiny deer around. He wanted to concentrate on the bigger ones, so to speak. So they were reclassified. Instead of being king's quarry, which you could have been hung for killing, they became beasts of the warren, which meant any peasant was then allowed to get a sharp stick and kill one and eat, and it opened up a new source of food for them, and they literally nearly wiped them out. Since around 1920s or thereabouts, there have been reintroductions across the country, and they have spread like wildfire, as you'll see in a minute. So they can be found in almost all counties in the UK now. So whereas a few hundred years ago there was almost none. There's the distribution map, and you can see, like with the previous one, the dark colour, 1972, Scotland, where the bulk of the original survivors were, northeast, East Anglia, New Forest, and the Dorset area. And you can see that by 2007 how they spread, and I know that most of these gaps here now have roe deer in them at some sort. That picture is taken in July. You can see by the foxglove flowers and the bracken and so on. This is their summer coat, and I'll show you them in their winter coat in a minute, which again can confuse things a bit. They're this foxy red colour in the summer. They stand about 3 feet high, a very small, dainty little deer. So what can they get up to compared to the fallow? Well, similar sort of damage. They are more of a selective browser. In other words, they tend to live on the ends of the shoots of young shrubs, rose bushes, all the juicy little bits that grow on the end of tree seedlings and so on. If they can get into your garden, they will absolutely wreak havoc. There's one there stripping a standard rose tree. You can probably just see there his antler is a pinky red colour. That's because it stopped growing, and the protective furry coat on the outside of the antlers is beginning to irritate him, so he's trying to rub it off on the tree. And then that results in this sort of a situation where he's skinned all the bark off the tree as well, and that kills the trees. And there's another one there where he's, even though it had a protective guard on it, he still destroyed the guard and the tree. So they can do damage in a variety of ways apart from just eating the trees. There's a roe deer in winter coat, so you see how it's changed from that foxy red colour. And now here's what I said about the tails. That isn't a tail, it's just a little sort of fibrous, like a shaving brush. So he has no visible tail. So if a little deer runs off, whatever colour it is, and they have this lightish patch on the back end and no visible tail, it is a roe deer. So you've got fallow with a big long tail with a black stripe down the middle, roe deer with no visible tail at all. But it does get confusing for people, I appreciate, if they've not come across them or whatever before. So gardens are very vulnerable to browsing. They love roses, ivy, vegetables, all types of tempting food are sources for these deer. And obviously, if they're in your garden and it's your pride and joy, as lovely as it is to see them, you may not appreciate them being there. Now this is the real problem in the pile, if you like. This REEVE'S Muntjak escaped from Woburn Abbey, or possibly was released. There have been various versions of how they got out. And the key to this is that they breed every 7 months from the age of 7 months, so they're very prolific. And as a result of that, they don't have a closed season. So people who are involved in controlling deer populations, there is no restriction on when they can be shot, because you cannot predict when the females will be pregnant, as with the other species that have a set closed season. So there's no closed season. So the sort of recommendation is that, if possible, when controlling them, if you can see that a doe is heavily pregnant, that is the one you shoot. That may seem a bit hard, but if she isn't carrying a youngster, then it means she's got a dependent youngster somewhere in the bushes. So it's better to cull a heavily pregnant female than leave a dependent little fawn to fend for itself or possibly starve to death. So as a result, not many of the females get culled, which is the wrong way round for, yes?
How many do they produce at a time?
Only one.
Just the one?
One normally, yes, yes. I should have said also the roe deer nearly always produce 2, so they're very prolific as well. But yeah, these are sort of a bit of an anomaly compared to our other species. They've got fangs, top and bottom, which can inflict pretty horrendous injuries on dogs and humans and so on if they get cornered. Quite a few RSPCA people and the like have been put in hospital by them, if you get one to try and catch it, and they will attack you in all ways possible and inflict some very serious wounds. And back to the tail business, they have a short tail of 3 to 4 inches long, and when they're spooked they erect the tail and the underside is bright white. So if you see an animal run away and it's got this white erect tail, that is a muntjak. No matter what else you might think it is a muntjak deer. And people get confused between roe deer and muntjak. If they're not familiar with seeing them, they know that they're smaller than the big fallow, but it's the tail that gives you the evidence as to what it actually is. So they are, again, like the roe, selective feeders. They're very particular in what they like to eat, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. A lovely, sleek little animal, stays more or less the same colour all year round. It's dark, sort of chestnutty conker colour, with black facial markings and a little round black shiny nose. And when they walk, they look a little bit like a pig, slightly hunched back. They wander about in the wood, they hardly stand still ever, they just keep wandering around looking for food and feeding. And you can see on this distribution map, you see in 1972, each one of these squares is 10 kilometres square, so it gives you some idea. They weren't very widespread in 72, and now we know they're all over here, they're all the way up there, and they've even crossed the Irish Sea into Ireland. You think, well, how on earth could this little tiny deer walk all out across Wales style, or up to the top of Scotland, or swim to Ireland? Well, it's what we term as the Ivor Williams factor. If anybody you know of a man called Ivor Williams, he manufactures stock trailers and metal bodies to go on the backs of Land Rovers and pick up trucks. And what happened is these little things are very easy to catch live in a cage trap. And well-meaning people catch them, put them in a vehicle and take them somewhere else and drop them off. And that's how they've spread and across the Irish Sea. totally illegal because they're an illegal alien species. They should not be here, and technically if you get one cornered or catch somewhere, like with grey squirrels, according to the law you are supposed to humanely dispatch it. So, you know, that's entirely up to the individual, but that's what the law says. They are an alien species and they have no right to be here, technically. The good news is they taste very good. So there's a male. You can just see his little tail, got this sort of humped back, and here you see his facial markings a bit better. And in addition to the tusks in his mouth, he's got these very sharp, usually little single-pointed antlers, and they also are vicious weapons. And he will do everything he can to get away or defend himself. I got called some years ago to remove one from someone's house in the middle of Hereford. We've no idea how it got there, but some well-meaning person, it had run in the house, so they shut the door, thinking they were doing the right thing. And he went into the kitchen and he destroyed the kitchen. He went up the walls, rang the shelves, destroyed everything. Absolute carnage and chaos. Well, I couldn't shoot it in the kitchen, could I? So we had to rugby tackle it and wrap it up in a blanket, tie it in there, get it into my car because the children of the household were pleading, oh, you won't hurt it, will you? No. So halfway home, if you know it, up travelling north on the A49 road to go over Dinmore Hill, and I look in my mirror and there's this thing sat up in the back of the car. Luckily he stayed there. I thought if he comes into the home, we're in big trouble. But they can cause a lot of problems. And I vowed I would never try and catch a live one again because their hooves are like razors, they've got these tusks and antlers. It's not their fault. I mean, so what do they get up to? What do they eat? What sort of impact do they cause? And you'll see that perhaps the relevant and importance of some of the damage that they do. Early purple orchids, yeah, quite an important flower in a woodland situation. Bluebells, oxlips, and here we have some coppicing, hazel. Someone is trying to re-establish coppice regime. And this is typical muntjak damage. They like to eat the tender shoots off the ends of the stems, the little buds, the little juicy bits on the ends. But of course they can't always reach up to the top of there. So the clever little devils have learned that if they reach as far as they can and just nip the stem, and the stem will fall over, then they can get them the tasty bits at the end that they want. So if you see that sort of damage, you know, even if you don't see the deer, you know what's caused it. It is a muntjak without question. And a lot of the work I do is on coppice sites where nature groups and societies and so on want to rekindle coppice regime because of the benefits to the ecosystems, the habitat, the bugs, the beetles, the birds, and everything else. So it's quite an important habitat. And then you get these things come along and they will completely destroy it. So, you know, again, they're lovely to see, but not necessarily what you want. Here's a picture taken through a broadleaf woodland. There's an electric fence there. On the right-hand side, you can see an abundance of bushes and trees, regeneration, and bluebells. And on this side, where the muntjak have got access, very, very little. They have grazed it off. And if they're left to that without being checked, they will completely destroy it until there's nothing left. And there's an example of just that. That's a wood in Cambridgeshire, an ancient coppice site managed by a wildlife trust. They wanted to restart the coppice regime, so they cleared 5 acres of it. They wouldn't protect it. They wouldn't have anything done about the muntjak because it went against their sort of ethics, if you like. And the muntjak, over a period of time, totally destroyed the whole site. There is nothing there apart from a few mature trees which were there before and this very rough, coarse grass. So eventually they had to concede and accept that deer control had to be implemented, otherwise there would be nothing left. So why do we need to manage them? So non-intervention can lead to damage to sensitive habitat, agricultural crops and so on, as we've just seen. Possible decline in complicated woodland ecosystems, and that's something that I think sometimes we don't always understand. If we get a wasp come in our house, we frantically chase it round and try and swat it, but it's part of an ecosystem. Same with a whole heap of insects and creatures and so on. They might be a nuisance to us and we might find them irritating and so on, but they all play a very important part in that big system. And of course, if you take woodland habitat away from some of those creatures, insects and so on, there's a big gap in it. And an increase to disease amongst animal populations when we get things like foot and mouth outbreaks, TB and all those sorts of things. Whatever it is, wherever it is, if you get a higher density of animals, there's a greater risk of disease breaking out and spreading. And increase in deer vehicle collisions. Nationally, there's something like 70-odd thousand collisions with deer and vehicles in this country a year, and up to 20 humans killed as a result. There's a picture of a deer stuck through somebody's radiator grill. We were down, Caroline and I were down in, where were we, South Monmouthshire on the weekend doing a survey, and we saw the nearest thing to a deer collision I have ever seen. A fallow doe shot out of wood one side, straight in front of a car that was probably doing between 40 and 50 miles an hour. And how they didn't collide, I have no idea. But if they had done, that deer would have gone straight through the windscreen. And who knows what that would have resulted in, but almost certainly some serious injuries. So if you little muntjak there weighing 20 or 30 pound, they tend to stay sort of lowish down in the car. You've got a big deer, they come over the bonnet and go through the windscreen. And I've seen pictures where they've gone through the windscreen and out through the back window. So you can imagine that in that sort of a situation, what's in between in the car is a dreadful mess. So it is an important part of deer in the country and in the wild. And there's the map that a colleague did when he did a project for the Highways Agency. And it's not surprising that where the highest number of deer vehicle collisions with deer is where there's the highest population of human beings as well. So you've got these two things of lots of people and lots of deer, and they don't always mix. So, some more examples of what I do and why we do it and so on. This picture is taken in the Wire Forest near Kidderminster. We know that these oak trees are 80 plus years of age. I don't know if you've ever been in the Wire Forest, but it's a big area. And oak trees are pretty prolific at reseeding. They drop acorns every autumn. And when you look through here, you would normally expect to see 80 years worth of regeneration. In other words, tree seedlings of progressive ages right up to these big mature trees. But apart from one little twisted bent one there, there's very little. If you look, I don't know whether you can see or not, but there's sort of lots of little light-coloured wispy bits. They are millions, and that's no exaggeration, millions of little oak trees. So where's the ones between these and those? They're not there. And I'll show you why. This post is quite a significant part of that picture. Sorry, I'll just go back to that a second. I pulled one of those up and I cut it through. And there on that little tiny stem, which was about that high, was 7 years of growth, 7 annular rings. So those little seedlings were 7 years or thereabouts in age. There's the post, and if you look to the left of that post, there's lots of young oak trees growing. That area had, in some previous life, been fenced to exclude the deer. So you see, once the deer were excluded, those acorns were able to grow into trees. And surprise, surprise, when the site manager wasn't looking, I got my little rusty knife out and cut one through, and they were 7 years old as well. So you can see that the impact that those deer are having on that forest is colossal. If the deer were not checked, if they were not controlled, or something done to exclude them, then they will eventually destroy the forest. People will often say to me, oh, we'll just put a fence around. That solves the problem. No, it doesn't. It usually makes the problem worse, because if you exclude them from an area, you then increase the density outside that area. So you intensify the problem, excuse me, beyond the wire fence. In a forest situation, sod's law is a gust of wind comes, a branch comes out of a tree, or a whole tree tips over, it goes through the fence, and in will pile the deer big time, because you've then produced a salad bowl for them to live on. And they're far more difficult to get out than they are to get in. So a fence isn't necessarily the answer to the problem. It is the density of the population which is usually the problem. I won't identify who owns or manages this site, but it is a nature trust, and you can see how bare that forest floor is. And again, virtually nothing regenerating. There's no succession of trees. These are ash trees, and I would bet that ash trees are probably the most prolific of all species we have in this country. Again, where we were last weekend, down in sort of South Monmouth, South Wales area, we were in parts of the forest there where there was ash trees, and there again was thousands and thousands of little ash seedlings growing. There was none in there. They had been eaten off regularly by the deer. And also the ivy, a key indicator for the likes of me, deer love ivy. So if we go into a wood and we see it's grazed off, at whatever height it's been grazed at will tell us what species of deer is the prominent species there, because the little deer can't reach as high as the big ones. So again, classic examples of very high deer impact. If that meets your objectives, then fine. But if you're trying to manage that site for the ecosystem of the wood, or for it to naturally regenerate, or whatever reasons, then you don't particularly want that sort of a situation. So here's a lovely woodland scene, a green ride through a wood. And as it happens, most of the sort of plants and flowers that some of these deer species love grow on the sides of woodland rides and edges, somewhere between the high canopy and the ground level. So this is a very important habitat in a woodland as far as we are concerned, and as far as the deer are concerned. It just so happens that your butterflies, your various sorts of insects love that sort of habitat as well. That's what they need. They need low vegetation with plenty of light, so they can go about their business, they can feed, they can breed, and so on. So it's quite key to all of them, and there's a vast array of them. And so with the small bird species, 75% of our small birds live and thrive in that sort of habitat. Low, bushy, scrubby habitat, whether it be tree seedlings trying to make their way up, or bramble, or flowers, or whatever, or shrubs. So it's quite an important sort of habitat. So, as much as we may love seeing deer in the woods, and trust me, I'm fortunate I'm able to spend a lot of time watching deer in their natural habitat and going about their daily life undisturbed. But if we want to see some of these in our woods as well, we can't have lots of deer, unfortunately. There just is not room, or it's not possible. And again, it's looking after these fragile woodland ecosystems. You take one of these out and there's a big gap in the system, and other things that depend on them will suffer, and so on down the line. Now, you don't have any of these in Shropshire at the moment as far as I'm aware, but like with the Muntjak, there are devious people out there who are desperate to get them released in other bits of woodland. Again, where we were the other day, there's a huge number of these in the Forest of Dean, which you may have seen on television. You may have heard about, there was Ray Mears on the television a few weeks ago, talking to people in the Forest of Dean and discussing the pros and cons of wild boar back in our woodlands. They have every right to be there. They are one of our ancient animals, but for all sorts of reasons, mainly because I expect somebody at the last one. For several hundred years we haven't had any. And then these turned up in the Forest of Dean, I don't know, 12 or 15 years or so ago. And there are people out there who will tell you they're fantastic. We need them in the woodlands because their feeding activities scarify the soil. They dig the soil up, and that provides a nice fine bed of soil for the seedlings to germinate in and plants to grow, and it helps the wood regenerate. Well, we'll see. The main thing to start off with, the ones down there are not European wild boar. They might look like it, and I'll show you a picture of one in a minute. They've got a long snout, lots of thick, black, hairy bristles, but they're feral pigs. A native European wild boar will have 1 litre of piglets of 4 to 5 once a year. These characters down the Forest of Dean, because they're crossbred with domestic pigs, will have up to 2.5 litres of 10 to a dozen a year. So their potential to increase is enormous. So of course the potential to cause destruction also is enormous. That was taken in somebody's garden, just outside Monmouth, just on the outskirts of Monmouth, and trust me, he was not happy. They turned the whole place over in a matter of a couple of 3 days, mainly because of the end of the snout. But they look like wild boars, don't they? You see pictures in the book? They look just like wild boar. That's the school playing field in the middle of the Forest of Dean. That was the second time they'd done that. It had previously been resurrected, reseeded and rolled and so on, and then along they come again and dig it up again. In one night. That's not sort of several days or weeks, that was one night. So again, I expect the games master wasn't too happy about that. Here is another site down the Wye Valley, again just about 5 miles south of Monmouth, and there is acres and acres of bluebells in this wood. Beautiful sight in the spring, and these things have come in at night and grubbed it up and eaten the bluebells, eaten tons and tons of bluebells. Not just the flowers, the whole bulb, everything. So I'm sorry, but I don't believe that is what you term scarify in the soil. Yeah, they turned it over, but that's not, in my book, that's not scarification. So, part of what we do when we go to groups like yours, but unfortunately we can't do it today, but one of the things we do is we go around various groups and organisations and so on, and we give them a similar talk to what I've just gone through now. And then we will cook tasters for you to try, and maybe we could arrange something on another day. Because in sort of what we've been doing in the past, we've found when we speak to people like yourselves, do you eat venison? And quite often the reply is, oh yeah, I don't like it, it's dry, it's tough, it's gamey, and comments like that. So we then go about dispelling that myth, because it is a myth, trust me. How are we doing for time? All right. A lot of this belief that venison is tough and gamey and so on comes from back in history, when most of the venison available to us would be from a red deer. That's the biggest species we've got in the country, which in my opinion is the least desirable of the meats, but that's just perhaps me. Comes from red venison. It's probably lived up on the mountains in the Highlands of Scotland. It will have been culled in the autumn, which is in the middle of the breeding season, the rut. And these animals, as you've probably again seen on television, they charge around trying to keep their harem together. They get very frantic and worked up. They won't eat for several weeks, and as a result the flesh gets very tainted and with testosterone and stress. So the meat is foul, which is hardly surprising. So then when the customer comes along and has some on their plate and they try it, they say, ugh, dreadful stuff, there's only more venison. And this myth about it being gamey probably goes back to how it was handled from the time the animal was culled to it arriving on your plate. I know, because I've done it on purpose, you can hang a deer for 3 to 4 weeks in a refrigerated facility, and the meat does not get more gamey, it gets sweeter. The longer you hang it, the sweeter it will get. And the reason that this gamey thing has come about, I think, is from people who have experienced game birds, which are hung with the intestines in them, and the longer they are kept like that, the stomach juices leach out into the flesh and it goes sour. Whereas with a deer, as soon as it's shot, it's eviscerated and all that is removed straight away at the point of when it was culled. So you don't get that process happening. And even cookbooks will still tell you that you have to marinate it in wine for days on end, and then you throw the meat away and drink the wine, sort of thing. And again, it's a myth, in my opinion. And we spent a lot of time doing this, and as a result, we've created this little booklet which dispels a lot of these myths, explains a lot of the facts and figures about venison, about the different joints, the size of the joints, because obviously if you've got a muntjak which is that long by that high, and you want to have a haunch to feed a dinner party, well, you're not going to feed many people on 4 pounds of meat. The other end of the scale, if you've got a red deer haunch and you want to feed 6 of you, you don't want a haunch that weighs 30 to 40 pounds. So there's all those sort of bits and pieces. And this is available, but I think the best way I could make it available to you is that if I emailed a copy to Pauline and then you contact her and you can download it for free that way. It just gives you a bit broader picture about venison and the different venisons and so on. And there are a few recipes in there to just show you the versatility of the meat. You can do more things with venison than you can with any other red meat. It's extremely versatile, but it does need more understanding, a bit more sympathetic handling and cooking than perhaps some of the others are. But anyway, there it is. So, see, it's not all bad news. It is very nourishing food. One of the first jobs that I did for the Deer Initiative, this is about 12 miles south of where I live, I was asked to conduct a project. This particular area had very high deer populations, all fallow deer in those days. That's changed slightly now, but it was all fallow deer. And there was very high road casualties as well, up to 50 a year being killed on the roads. And so Natural England and the Forestry Commission decided that something had got to be done about it because the situation was so serious. And the 2 key landowners at the time wanted a license for felling timber for whatever they wanted to do. But the 2 organisations stood side by side, and for the first time ever they refused a felling licence. And it caused a huge amount of bad feeling between those organisations and the landowners or woodland owners. And there was great big protests all up and down the country and so on. But they stood firm. They said, no, we cannot allow this situation to continue because if you cut the trees down, nothing will regrow. And these were triple SI sites, sites of special scientific interest. So they were quite important sites. So anyway, after a lot of negotiating and various things, it was agreed. And I spent weeks going around this area, quite a big area, at night with a thermal image camera trying to assess the population. And that's one of the biggest obstacles we have, is to have, if I go to somebody and say, you've got far too many deer, you need to cull some, they say, well, how many have we got? Who knows? And you'll see why in a minute. So I spent several weeks going around at night trying to count them at night with a thermal image camera. We had other people going around the woods trying to assess population by impact. And between us, we came up with an idea that there was about 350 deer, we thought, living in that area. So it was 3 miles by perhaps a mile. Yeah, quite a big area, would be. And we were ridiculed by the locals, by all sorts of people, saying we didn't know what we were talking about, we were talking absolute rubbish, there's no one you get that many, etc., etc., etc. Completely independent of us, we were just providing the information. The 2 owners called in some private contractors, and over 2 winters they culled over 600 deer. Excuse me. And importantly, there was still a lot of deer left. So it just shows you how high a population can be, and nobody realised. Even us who were supposedly the experts, if you like, we have no idea there was that many there. So, between 2005, you would think that somebody stringed that every day, and it was like that all the way through the wood. Bare as that. There was nothing, no undergrowth, no understory, no little birds, no insects, because there was nowhere for them to live. And within 5 years, sorry, that's the same path. So you can see the transformation from a bare, desert-like woodland floor, and here we had masses of insects, masses of little birds move back in, tree seedlings growing everywhere, and we had some deer as well. So you can see how population management is quite important. Some deer in a wood are beneficial because they will keep areas open, their feeding, grazing habits, etc., etc. So that we need open areas for all sorts of reasons. So some are very important and necessary. They are part of the ecosystem, but if they get too many, you can see what happens. They just destroy the lot. So, I hope you're able to make some sense out of all of that. Is there any questions now? Please shout out. Yes, sir.
Have you had any incidents of ticks and Lyme disease?
Yes. Right, the question, in case you couldn't hear, was about ticks and Lyme's disease. There's a thing called the castor bean tick, which has a rather peculiar sort of life cycle. It gets onto an animal's leg and crawls up its body and then lives through its cycle and then drops off and so on. But it feeds on the blood of the host. It'll get on your dogs, get on your cats, any mammals that live in the woods, and of course it'll get on you if you go walking through the forest, particularly heather, brackeny type ground cover. Some areas when you get home you'll find that up to your hips you'll be covered in little ticks, and of course they bury their nose in your skin to feed on your blood, and then if they're carrying the Lyme's disease themselves, they will then infect you with it. And usually what happens, if that happens, where the bite was, you'll get rings appear, red inflamed rings and yellow rings as the infection spreads. And you develop what's like acute flu symptoms. And if it's not treated, it will get worse and worse until it can almost cripple you. I know one or two people who had it very badly and they've struggled to get about. It is treatable with antibiotics. So if you go walking in any of these areas and you find a tick on you, it would be worth going along to your GP and just explain and say, can you do a test, please? There is a blood test so they can see if you have picked up Lyme's disease, and then they'll give you these antibiotics. The only drawback to that is they are blooming awful antibiotics, trust me. But it's better that than Lyme's disease. But you may not realise you've got it to start with. You just ache and feel sort of. Yes, sir.
Can I point out that if you go to somewhere like Millet, you can buy little tick removers. And if you've got a tick on you, don't try and get it off with your fingers or a penknife, because you won't come off.
You leave the head in there. Yeah.
And I've known two people who've had really extraordinary bad experiences.
Yeah. Just in case those at the back there didn't hear what the gentleman was saying, it's absolutely right that if you find one of these on you, don't grab it and try and pull it off, because you leave the head of the tick behind, so that hasn't solved the problem. And there is special little tools that you can get that they're like a fork, and you put them in underneath the tick's head, you turn it round and then you pull the head out. You can get them all sorts of places, chemist shops and various places like that. So you need to be a bit mindful that how you remove the tick from you. Yes, madam?
What does a tick look like?
What does a tick look like? I don't have a picture with me, unfortunately. But you know what a ladybird looks like? Well, it's a bit like that, only it's sort of a browny grey. And the more blood it extracts from you, the fatter it will get. Dogs are quite susceptible to them because they go ferreting about in the undergrowth and then they get on them and so on. So again, don't just pull them off the dog. You need to actually remove the head out of the dog's skin.
In Scotland there was a PhD study done. Hang on, I'm deaf. In Scotland there was a PhD study, and 1 in 5 of the ticks they found actually carried lines again.
It is something that you need to be mindful of. You need to look after your own well-being. When I say if there's any doubt in your mind, pop along to your GP and just explain, and simple blood tests can relieve all your fears perhaps. Anything else? Yes, madam.
Were the feral pigs escapees?
If I was trying to be politically correct, I'd say possibly. Like with the Muntjak, there is various stories put about these feral pigs. Some people claim they escaped from a local farm. Who knows? But the ones in the Forest of Dean allegedly came from 2 different farms, one each end of the forest, and they got out and invaded the forest. The sad thing, I think, is that we now have a situation where the Forestry Commission, who manage most of the forest, are working their socks off to try and control the numbers because of the impact. I mean, the pictures I showed you are minuscule, the level of impact down there. It is horrendous. Every grass verge, right through the forest, villages, gardens, woodland, completely destroyed by them. And it's getting worse. So they're working their socks off to try and reverse the damage. There's another group of enthusiasts, and I can sort of understand their logic, but they are dead against these pigs being culled. They say, no, historically they should be here, they have every right to be here. But as I said in the beginning, they are not wild boar. They are basically domestic pigs that look like a wild boar. And the damage is unbelievable. To the point now where the Forestry Commission rangers, when they go into the forest in the morning, first light or even before daylight, to start their work, there are people there protesting, trying to stop them, getting in the way, to the point where one of the rangers has now been put on permanent sick leave for several months because of the continual hassle and harassment that these people are causing them. Is that right? Yeah, I don't know. But I think the damage speaks for itself. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll come to you next.
So you want to be my question? I'm a very enthusiastic consumer of red meat,
Yeah.
but all too rarely it's venison. We did pick up some up in the market locally a few weeks ago, and it cooked very easily. Of course, it's more expensive, but hardly anything seems to be done to promote the use of this meat, and I think maybe you should be doing a bit more in that respect.
Watch this space. Yeah, in case anybody didn't hear that, the question was about basically where can you get local wild venison. And the final comment is, something needs to be done about it. Well, we have been actively doing something about it. We've just done a massive study down the Wye Valley, all down the Welsh border, into everything to do with the venison and ending up where does it go to, who processes it, and so on. And fingers crossed, based on what we've, the information we have gathered and the recommendations we have made, we're now about to start on the second phase where we are going to, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do it yet, but we're going to train the butchers and the processors what they should be doing with the venison as opposed to lamb, beef or pork, and chefs and restaurateurs as to how they could be cooking it to make it available for people like yourselves to enjoy. And then the next phase, I hope, will be to run out the same sort of a thing to the general public. There's something like 500,000 wild deer culled in this country a year. A lot of that is currently exported, and yet there's people desperate to get hold of it and don't know where to buy it. Attingham Park, I suggest, if anybody of you knows where Attingham Park is, they're only just down the road. I know they're park deer as opposed to wild, but they live freely in the park. I know they sell it, so it may be worth popping down there if you're in that direction to get it. There was a gentleman here. What did he say?
It's a related question. Is it safe to eat wild venison?
Simple answer is yes. we find that wild deer suffer from very few diseases, illnesses, and so on. The one big fear from people is bovine TB and everything that goes with that. So we've done a lot of work with DEFRA and various people and organisations or whatever to establish are wild deer a host of bovine TB. And the short answer to that is, without going into a lot of details, is no, they're not. But they're a mammal, so yes, they can pick it up, they can carry it, and they can transfer it onto other mammals. But the incident rate of wild deer and bovine TB is something like 3% of all the carcasses tested. Now you might think 3% is quite high, but it's not. It is a handful, literally. When a wild deer is culled, for the person to sell it on, in simple terms, he has to be qualified to carry out a post-mortem at the site of killing, to look for indicators on the lymph nodes of the animal as to whether it's fit and healthy or not. And if there's any suspicion, he is obliged under the legislation to contact animal health. They will take tissue samples and test them in a laboratory to see, and they can't go in the food chain until they've said yes or no. So that's a sort of simple description of it. There was somebody else was waving a hand somewhere. Was that it? You had enough? Oh, the lady right at the back. You'll have to shout a
If you're
bit.
going to kill these deer and get the butchers to deal with it, and there are so many that you're culling, it will bring the price of venison down.
I don't know what you say. One of the things that we were able to prove when we did this study a while ago, and this is why we need to talk to butchers and processors and so on. One of the comments that we get from them regularly when we go to them and say, right, we see you're processing or selling this and so on, why is the price so high? Is that the question, roughly? Their answer to us quite often is, well, if those so-and-sos out there that bring us the deer could shoot better, there'd be less waste. Because what happens, the legislation says we can only use specific types of firearms to cull the deer. And of course, you fire a high-velocity bullet through the side of an animal, it's going to cause damage to the flesh, unlike an animal going to an abattoir where damage is virtually nothing. So the nature of culling them itself will cause flesh damage. There's things called best practice, which the Deer Initiative have created to cover all aspects of deer management. And in the best practice guides, it tells you, it recommends where you should shoot them to bring about as fast a humane death as possible, i.e. straight through the main organs, heart, lung, liver area. Unfortunately, doing that, the hydrostatic shock wave, which is carried by the bullet, will rupture a large number of blood vessels. In other words, a giant bruise. Well, the butchers and the processors are not allowed to put that into the food chain, so it's scrap. And I could show you photographs if we had time of animals where 2/3 of the body is bruised, that far from the bullet hole. But it just happens to be how the bullet has struck the animal, from which angle, what is hit inside, what blood vessels and so on, and it's caused this massive rupture of blood vessels. So all that goes in. So the poor old game dealer has paid X amount per kilo for an animal whole with the skin on. So they're always handled with the skin on. And it's not until he pulls the skin off he finds the extent of the damage. So the cost per kilo then goes sky high. He's then faced with disposing of that waste meat and bones. So that costs him more money to get rid of it. So that's part of the reason, and that's part of what we're about, is to try and train people to be more skillful, to shoot these deer in a place where it will cause less carcass damage, but it's inevitable that some will take place. You can't avoid it.
So yes, you tried Robin Hood technique, shoot with a bow and arrow?
No, but again, the short answer to that is it's illegal. The law states specifically what can be used, and bows and arrows, crossbows, and all those sort of things are illegal. And again, I could show you lots of photographs where we found animals with those sort of projectiles in them. And they've lived for weeks and sometimes months with a arrow stuck through their ribs or something like that. So it's not fair. If we're going to cull them, I think the first line is it has to be safe and it has to be as humane as possible. We should not prolong that animal's suffering. The benefit of that is, if you imagine a farm animal, we passed some this morning, farmers going to market with stock trailers and so on, taking stock into markets. The animals are rounded up on the farm, quite in order, quite well managed and looked after. Put into a trailer, they're trundled to a market, stressful, they're not used to it. They're poked and prodded round pens in the market, they're loaded back up onto another vehicle, taken off, and probably tomorrow they'll be humanely slaughtered in an abattoir. There is a level of stress that that animal undergoes. It can't be done any other way. It's done as humanely and as whatever as possible. But there is a level of stress. You get a wild deer in the woods where it was born, where it's lived, completely stress-free. And if the man on the end of the trigger gets it right, bang, and it's dead on the floor. Excuse me. Stress levels, almost zero. To my mind, that produces a far better quality meat than something that can be poked and prodded and pushed and shoved and so on. Perhaps it's just me, but that's the difference between the two methods, and that's why the legislation says we can only use specific types of firearms and in certain circumstances. Anything else before we all rush off for a cup of tea? Right, well, I hope you found it of some interest. You know, if at any time some of your smaller groups might want a bit of a chat about some other aspects of deer or venison or anything else, just give us a shout.
That was very interesting. Yes, I will put my hand up and say, yes, I love venison. I treat myself when I go to Scotland and eat it there. Patrick, we would like to say thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for such an interesting talk. And we hope to see you again.
My pleasure.
So everybody put your hands together.
As I said in the beginning, I've rushed through the subject. We can spend 5 days talking about this, and then we wouldn't cover it all. So I hope that it's just an insight for you into anything to do with wildlife.